We all love detective stories where policemen investigate the most challenging cases. And we bet you dreamed of catching criminals in your childhood. Brightside gives you the opportunity to feel like a real detective by solving cases using just a few hints. George Smith was murdered on Sunday evening. There were 5 other people in his house: Mr. Smith's wife, his personal cook, a butler, a housemaid, and a gardener. They all told Detective Stevens what they were doing that evening. Mrs. Smith was reading a book near a fireplace. The cook was making breakfast. The butler was giving instructions to workers in the living room. The housemaid was washing the dishes. The gardener was watering plants in the greenhouse. Right after all the conversations, the detective arrested the murderer. Who is the killer, and how did Stevens find the criminal? The answer is on the back. The detective was speaking to a doctor in a waiting room when a dismayed man rushed in and screamed, "Someone shot my wife." The detective asked the man to tell him everything. The man, Mr. Clark, said that he was at work when his housekeeper called him and said that something terrible had happened to his wife and that she was in the intensive care unit. He hung up immediately and went to the hospital. When Mr. Clark finished his story, the detective arrested him on an attempted murder charge. Why did he do this? A millionaire was shot in the forehead at home. The detective spoke to the millionaire's 3 sons, Jack, John, and James, who were at home. Jack said that night John, their father, and he had been at an official reception. They arrived home and entered the living room. His father came in, and then John and Jack. When their father came up to the stairs, James entered the living room and shot their father. John confirmed Jack's information. James said he had visited his friends that night. When he arrived home, his father was already dead. The detective understood everything immediately. Who is the killer, and how did Stevens resolve that case? The detective once had to find an escaped prisoner. He knew that the criminal was hiding in one of these houses. But he had to know the exact address so as not to frighten away the criminal. First, he took a photo of the houses with the help of a drone. When he looked at the photo, he realized where the criminal was. Where was that fugitive, and how was he found? Mr. and Mrs. Clyde went on a trip to the mountains. But 2 days later, Mr. Clyde returned home alone. He went to the police and said that Mrs. Clyde had fallen to her death. The next day, Detective Stevens visited Mr. Clyde and arrested him for his wife's murder. Clyde confessed his guilt and asked the detective how he'd found out he was the murderer. Stevens said he'd simply called a travel agent and asked for some information. What did the travel agent say to the detective? Mary and Ben lived with their 4 friends. One day, Ben came home and found Mary dead on a sofa. He called the police. The detective arrived and realized that Mary had been killed not so long ago. He interrogated all 4 friends. Mia was in the kitchen and said she'd come home 2 hours ago and gone to the kitchen. John was reading a book in the garden. He said he hadn't left the place that day. Jennifer said she had been swimming in a swimming pool for 3 hours. Jane was painting in her room. The detective asked everyone to show him their hands and found out who lied to him. That person was the murderer. How did Stevens discover the criminal? One morning, the detective had an argument with his wife and went away without his cell phone and keys. In the evening, when he returned home, he found his colleague, his scared wife, and a murdered man. Stevens's wife told her story. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the doorbell. I thought it was my husband and opened the door. But a criminal pushed me, and so I stabbed him with a knife. The detective ordered the policeman to arrest his wife because she had planned to kill him. How did the detective figure it out? A man told the police that he'd come home from work to find his wife's dead body lying in the middle of the parlor. He said she had apparently found his gun in his desk and shot herself. However, the policeman knew at once that the man was lying. How did he know? The man had an empty gun holster attached to his belt, which meant he'd either been about to take the gun with him or had it on him all along. The former couldn't be true because he said he'd come home from work and found his wife dead, which leaves us with the latter, proving that the man actually shot his wife. Illustrated by Elena Sofronova for Brightside.me. We all love detective stories where policemen investigate the most challenging cases. And we bet you dreamed of catching criminals in your childhood. Brightside gives you the opportunity to feel like a real detective by solving cases